back in the day, we were pitching a lot to different channels, and I just really came across this article in Salon.com about David and asexuality in general. And it was one of those articles, you know, that you read and you mention at a party, and people just sort of can't stop talking about it, and you're like, that's really interesting. But what's also really interesting about it was people were really kind of dismissive of it in an aggressive way, and that was something that as a filmmaker you're like, wow, like people were like, that's crazy, no way. And then you spend all night, and then it would evolve into people telling you really personal stories about themselves and about their sex lives, and I thought, oh, this is, yeah. So then, you know, I showed it to the article to Beth, and then David actually was randomly in town for something, and the three of us had a slice of pizza and kind of talked about, you know, asexuality and all that stuff, and it led to us going to San Francisco to film, and then us making it. It's funny whenever people ask that question, because I'm like, I don't know, it's like it started, and then it's kind of like a beast, you keep feeding the beast, and then you're like, well, I'm this far in, I guess we're making a movie together, so, yeah.
For David, my reaction to watching the film progress is that it must be difficult to have defined something, to define an identity, right? So how is it for you to kind of be seen as the person who's defining the boundaries or doing all the definitional work? So does that?
Well, before I answer that quickly, I just want to take this opportunity to thank you, Angela, especially, and Beth, and everyone that worked on this film for creating such an unbelievably spectacular tool for our community to raise dialogue and awareness around the world. And this is the third time I've seen this movie, and I'm still blown away by how incredible a job you did in representing our community and representing what our community is going through. And also on a personal level, how incredible a job you did of taking some very complex, deep personal experience that I had and representing it accurately, which is something I didn't expect would happen out of this movie, and I'm unbelievably grateful. So thank you. And to answer that question, I would say that early on, it was really scary, but also deeply liberating to sort of realize that on the one hand, holy shit, no one's talking about this. And if I want to see discussion about it, which I desperately, desperately wanted to see, then I've got to create that discussion. So that was terrifying, but it was also deeply, deeply liberating in a way to realize I was actually standing in the middle of a blank canvas. And there's so many people that have to struggle against the definitions that are put on top of them, that realizing that I could really sort of write it myself, and I think that was true for a lot of us early on in the asexual community, realizing that we could write it ourselves was deeply, deeply empowering. And the definitional work now, in 2011, is being done sort of within the community by new sort of emerging groups. So there's a whole group of people who identify as gray A, as sort of in between sexual and asexual, that are just beginning to come together and really define themselves and really articulate their experience. There's within the community a whole group of people who identify as gender neutral, so gender neutral, that are just beginning to come together and just becoming to define their experience. And so we're in a really cool place of kind of that definition continue to go on and splinter and encompass more people.
Questions from the audience? Yeah, Bob.
First, the whole subject of asexuality, and this is a beautiful film, holds up a mirror that I think is valuable for us all, of all sexualities. It just enriches our own awareness. So thank you for that mirror.
Thank you.
I have a question, and it's very physiological, biological, statistical, and I don't know how much Avon has researched where there are statistics, but I'm very curious as to arousal. If people who are asexual, who do feel just biologically aroused, and I have two questions. One, are there any statistics about asexual people who do masturbate just to clean the pipes, so to speak? And are there also statistics of people who do not masturbate, but who have more wet dreams or
So,
that kind of dream?
if I can jump in, there's one relevant study to what you're talking about. Really, two relevant studies, both done by Dr. Laurie Brotto, who was featured in the film. The first one that she mentioned that she'd done when filming was going on asked asexual people how often they masturbate, and she found that asexual people masturbate at about the same frequency as sexual people do. The second one she did on women was actually a physiological study. So she measured physiological sexual response in straight, gay, bi, and asexual women when they were watching sexually explicit material. And what she found was that the rate at which people measured, people reported feeling sexual arousal was very, very different. So the asexual people reported feeling sexual arousal and feeling sexually aroused or sexual desire at a very low level, and other people reported at a higher level. But the actual physiological response was the same. And what they're learning from studying asexual people is that everything that we think, we think that physical response and sexual arousal and sexual desire and sexual attraction all kind of are part of the same ball of spaghetti, and it turns out that they're not at all. And that all of this stuff is much, much more complicated than we thought it was, and much, much more interconnected in a much more complicated way than we thought it was, and talking about asexuality scientifically is teaching us that.
And just one thing to add, there haven't been that many studies on asexuality overall. So that was one of the things that we came across in making the film, is that really every person that's interviewed in the film are the people who've done studies on asexuality. And so our hope is one of our hopes of the film is that it will sort of breed kind of more interest in learning more about asexuality overall.
I'm just kind of interested in, are there figures for the percentage of women that are asexual and men that are asexual? But it seems to me from watching the movie that there was a higher percentage of women, especially in the lecture scene, the lecture in New Jersey that you gave, that looked like an audience of 80% women.
The gender, sex division, and asexual.
So the question was, if there's statistics about the breakdown of women and men in the asexual community. And you talked specifically about the lecture that I gave in New Jersey. The audience of that lecture was not primarily identified as asexual. They were just students at Jew University, and for some reason more women were interested in going to the lecture. On the asexual community itself, we have a measure of that, but it's bad. People can self-identify a gender. They can write in any word they want to as their gender. And when you go in and look for sort of common female words, and common, like, girl, woman, female, F, those are much more prevalent than male words, boy, man, M, male. But it's hard to say whether that means that there's actually more women than men, whether that means that women are just more likely to say what their gender is, whether it means that there are more women than men that want to spend time on an online forum that happens to have a pink background talking about their sexuality. So it's statistically, just the research hasn't been done to really see across the population of people identify as asexual as a whole.
Yeah.
I was surprised by what I would call the negativity of Dan Savage. He was someone that I, even after this film, I respected. But I would say I was surprised by maybe the hostility and prejudice. Maybe that was just me. But I'm wondering, any of you, is your personal experience, not scientific, that negative attitudes against asexuals, is it more from queer people or more from straight people? And whichever one you answer, why do you think that is?
You take that and I'll take the Dan for it.
Cool. I'll speak to the Dan bit a little bit.
Yeah.
So Dan just invited me on his show last week, a little bit to make peace. He's been sort of going back and forth with the asexual community for a while, and the more he's gotten letters from people that are talking about asexuality, the more he's kind of taken time to think about it, and he's coming around and I think having a much more accepting, respectful stance on the asexual movement, which is great. And he's also, the entire time, even when he's been very skeptical, and very, very good, I think, about reaching out to me and reaching out to other people in the asexual community, and asking us to articulate what our experience is, and giving that room in his column on his show. So he's gone about this in a very respectful way, and like you, I have a lot of respect for him. I think in terms of where we get negative feedback, it's from people for whom I've found people either dismiss us offhand and say that's impossible, that can't exist. You know, your sexuality is a vital part of being human, and so there's got to be something wrong with you if you're asexual. Or they just sort of ignore us and think that we're invisible or we don't matter, we're not interesting. And the only real negative responses I get are from people for whom sexuality is a cornerstone of their worldview. And they can't see, they can't envision their daily experience. They can't envision sort of having a positive life without sexuality. And so the power struggle around being able to articulate their own sexuality has been such a central part of their life that when they hear that there's someone who's not going through that, they immediately reject it. Queer people, I think, when they haven't had time to think asexuality through, sometimes have the strongest negative responses, and when they have had time to think it through and they see the overlap, which most do right away, then they're by far our strongest allies.
And just one thing I want to say specifically about Dan and his role in the film. You know, we got a lot of flack from the asexual community for having Dan Savage in the film because it's pretty, you know, the way he feels has been pretty clear. The great thing about Dan Savage is he doesn't really care what you think of him. So you can sort of have him say anything, and he doesn't really care. But I thought it was important. I mean, we thought it was kind of important to do an interview with him because he's so charismatic and interesting, but also because, you know, he has a point of view that a lot of people have, and the goal of making the film is to allow people to have a lot of conversations in sort of a deeper way and not just have you sit in the audience and say, I'm going to tell you about asexuality. You're not allowed to ask any questions. You just have to sit there and say, yes, yeah, okay, you're telling me something new. Like, I thought it was important to have people who had various points of view, and Dan Savage, you know, he has a lot of interesting ideas, and also he knows a lot about asexuality. I mean, that's the thing. He's taken time to learn more about it, whereas a lot of people don't know anything about it. So to get an interview with somebody who is sort of as smart as he is and understands the asexual community is important. And he, you know, he is someone who believes that asexuality exists, but one of the things he says, it's not in the film, is he's like, people don't call into my show when things are great. People call into my show when there are problems. And most of the people who are calling into my show who are having problems and it's tied to asexuality, there's probably something else going on. So I think it's kind of an important thing to just...
And one quick thing just about how, in our experience, we experience reactions from society at large about asexuality is that Angela and I found that younger generations are just much more fluid in how they view sexual orientation, gender identity, identity in general. And, you know, in rough cuts, sometimes people would say, well, it seems like a young film, it seems like a young movement. But in some ways it is, because people are really starting to question the way we look at things in general.
Yeah, I would like to know, why did you put this part in the movie where the woman put a nail to it?
Yes, the nail.
It doesn't seem to, for me,
know.
be connected.
No, I know. I take a lot of heat for the nail. A lot of it. I fought for the nail. I can explain the nail. Lots of people think I should take it out, but Elizabeth, the nail is just who Elizabeth is. I mean, it wasn't like I said, put a nail in your face. Like, she said, I do this cool trick. And Jolene said, hey, let's see it. And we filmed it, you know? So, I mean, and Beth was there. She can attest to that. But it really is just such a part of who Elizabeth is. And I understand that there's kind of this thing about making it seem like asexuals are freaks by having the nail be put in her head, but that's who she was, and so I just thought it was good to see. But I take a lot of heat for the nail, and all of you who don't like it know that there's been a lot of conversation.
And if I can piggyback off that, not having known there was a lot of conversation about the nail, I'm glad to hear that. There's a certain extent to which we're freaks,
yeah,
and we have to become okay with that. and a part of the struggle of being asexual is like learning to own that and learning to like make that experience empowering. And I think that she is a really, really powerful example of how that happens. Right here.
Question about documentary film and the movement. We see a lot of documentary films about different movements, and in particular the gathering of the people from around the country in San Francisco, which is sort of the centerpiece of this movie. Was that, for example, and other things in the movie, was that going to happen even if you were not making a movie, or did that happen because you were pulling people together for the documentary movie?
No, Pride, that was happening. I mean, it was really literally, we had filmed with David a little bit. We were in San Francisco right before that Pride, and we knew that that was happening, and that was sort of the first time that the asexual community had marched in Pride. And I mean, I wasn't even there. I sent a shooter, and so these things were, we didn't really set up much of anything in the movie. Okay, the meetup in New York is kind of set up, but everything else is organically happened, and we were there. So I mean, we really just chronicled the asexual movement, and these were the things that were happening. It would be like David sending us a text or an email or something saying, this is happening, do you want to film it?
And the meetup in New York just brought one person?
Well, no, I mean, we set it up, so, you know. We tried to have like an organized meetups, but a lot of, I mean, you can speak to this, a lot of, because asexuality is still kind of a new movement, especially, and a lot of people are organizing online, physical meetups don't happen that much. So, and it kind of got to a point where we were like, we need like physical meetups, because like, I don't want to film people sitting in front of their computers, that's really boring. So, you know, but for the most part, these were things that was kind of organically happening in the movement, we just covered it.
And I'll just add to that, that for whatever reason, we've had meetups sort of slowly developing in different cities, organically, around the world, and for whatever reason, New York has just been very stop and start. I'm looking at you all, this row, to get your business together. And so hopefully we're getting to a point now where New York can begin to have a more regular community. But you know, Davis, California, 12 of them meet up like 3 times a week and watch Doctor Who and talk about the definition of romance. So like, it's happening.
You had a question here. Yeah.
What about children? There was something in it there.
Yeah.
And everybody seemed young. There were a few people who were older. But what about that piece of the future?
So for me personally, I know I really want kids. I know that I want to adopt kids. Really central, this was sort of hinted at.
Wait, one second.
You were asking about asexual children?
No, about having children. But what I'm saying is, sex is not just about that. It's also about reproduction, right? So in that part of it.
So the question is, what about children? What about having sex to have children?
Well, no, that's part of life. Yeah.
That's a part of life.
Yeah. No, just that sex is just not for sex. It's also for making humans.
Right. So sex, when certain people have sex, certain kinds of sex, it can make children. It's a tiny, tiny portion of the pie of sex. But, so for me personally, I feel very strongly that I want to have kids. I'm not particularly attached to those kids having my DNA. And so I don't feel a strong need to engage in sexual acts in order to have kids. I'd much rather adopt. It depends on what kind of relationship or relationships or community I wind up having kids in that may have a say in whether or not they have my DNA or not. But sort of more broadly within the asexual community, it's across the spectrum. There's a lot of people that really want kids, like me. There's a lot of people that don't necessarily want kids. Our society offers a wide, smorgasbord of options for how one can have close relationships with children in one's life. And we're exploring all of those.
I see.
Okay, right here.
I noticed in the film that it was talked about how much that asexuality wanted to be defined as an orientation. And you, at the beginning of many of the interviews, just put the definition out there. It's about not having sexual attraction. But then a lot of the film went on to talk a lot about other people's desires and how they had desire to have sex, desire not to have sex, desire to masturbate, not, and what their struggles were with the desires, and if they had it, or if they had sex or they haven't. So I was wondering if in the film, attraction attraction the only thing needed to define the orientation?
Well, I'm sure Michelle is sitting in her seat. There's a lot about the definition of asexuality that came up. Every single person in the film who defines it actually defines it differently. And, you know, some people would say it's attraction, some people say it's desire. So what we try to do is, in each person's section, to have them define asexuality the way they define it. So each person will say, I see asexuality as meaning this, so that you sort of have an understanding of how they see that within their lives. On the AVEN website, you know, the site that David created and sort of the site that a large portion of asexuals organize on, attraction is the word that's used, and that's how we mean it in the film. But what we try to do with each person in having them define it themselves is showing you this is how they're seeing it within their lives. And I mean, I think a lot is made of definitions around asexuality. That's something that I was noticing, and it's interesting because people just define it for themselves the way they define it for themselves, and we tried to just be true to that. And I think a lot of it is because it's a new thing for people, and they're still figuring out how they incorporate it into their lives, if that makes sense.
And if I can speak for sort of myself and some of the AVEN leadership, we want is for people to have a tool to figure themselves out, not necessarily to have a clearly defined label. And so if there's a word asexual and there's a bunch of people who are using that word in a bunch of different ways, and you can walk onto a website or walk into a meetup and you can find some pieces of that resonate with you, and you can cobble them together to create your own personal definition that helps you understand yourself better and kind of takes you on the next step of your journey of self-exploration, that's awesome. That's what we want. And we want that way more than we want any one clear definition that everyone's using.
Right here.
Speak up a little bit, I'm sorry.
As a leader of AVEN, you are exposed in media, you're in film, you're online, you're on TV, and as a progressive, as a public figure, your personal life is scrutinized. Do you feel pressure as you get older to keep talking or not talking about your personal experiences as an asexual? Do you think as the movement grows, you're going to continue to talk about what's going on with you personally, or do you feel like you're not going to want to talk about what's going on with you personally?
Can you repeat the question?
As the leader of the movement, or as the face of the movement, the poster child of the movement, you know, what are the responsibilities? What are the, you know, are you anxious about that? And how, you know, do you want it to end, essentially, if I could paraphrase?
Yeah. You're very open about talking about what's going on with you and
Yeah.
but are you thinking that you can feel that way as you get older, continue to get popularity, people ask questions, and
Can you keep on answering these questions?
Yeah.
forever?
How do I feel about answering personal questions like this forever? I think that it's something that I've gotten used to, and I believe really strongly that because one of the core values of our movement is self-exploration, I need to be continually exploring myself, and I need to continually be open and honest about how I'm exploring myself. And that is difficult at times. Like, I think there was a moment in the movie where I was in the midst of sort of exploring how I wanted to embrace romantic relationships in a new way, and I didn't have a good soundbite for it, and that was awkward to talk about. But I think that it's important for me to show, to demonstrate that process of self-exploration and being okay going into places where I'm confused, I don't understand myself completely, and I do it anyway. I don't think that I'm the only one in the community that's doing that now. There are other people who are very articulate, who are coming up, who are talking about their experiences. A lot of them are in the movie. And I think that especially as the community grows and becomes more diverse, we're going to have more and more and more of those people, and I'm probably going to become less of the lightning rod for all of it. But I think that it's something that, for the sake of creating an open, honest public discussion, it's something that I'm comfortable with.
In the back.
Asperger's and asexuality?
What is your take? Or what do you believe about the link?
Do you want to go?
Well, yeah. There haven't been too many studies on that. Yeah, I mean, it's really just like something that's discussed a lot on the website, and then various, Lori Brotto, who's in the film, she has started to discuss that, and in sort of one-on-one sessions with people that's come up, but there hasn't been a study specifically on that. That's something that various people have brought up, and we included it in the film because it is part of the dialogue around asexuality, and it is something that, various people are talking about, but, and David can talk more about sort of what's happening within AVEN and that.
So I don't have Asperger's. I wasn't that familiar with Asperger's before becoming involved with AVEN, and a whole subsection of the community that does have Asperger's. There wound to be a lot of overlap between AVEN and online communities of people with Asperger's. And what came out of that discussion was, I think, a really rich dialogue between us and between a subsection of the Asperger's community that doesn't see it as a disorder, that sees it as a natural part of human neurological diversity, and was really saying, look, we relate to other people in a different way, we kind of relate to the world with our brains in a different way, but we are having really good lives, and we don't think this is something that should be pathologized. And in that way, I think there was a really good natural alliance, kind of political alliance that came out of it. And so I have a lot of respect for the Asperger's community. I have a lot of good friends from AVEN that are part of both communities, that there's many people who are, Asperger's who are sexual, have Asperger's who are sexual, or who are asexual and don't have Asperger's. I think that that's such that you can't infer any causal relationships either way.
And also, I mean, Elizabeth in the film has Asperger's, and I think that was sort of our entryway to starting to do more research, sort of as filmmakers, because for her, and she says it in the film, she definitely sees that as there being sort of a linkage there. And so we started to research that primarily from meeting Elizabeth, and found that there was more people than we had initially thought.
Yeah, right here.
So the question was, at the end of the movie, I talked about how sexuality made people take relationships seriously, and you wanted sort of, where's my current thinking on that? I think that since the movie was finished filming, I've have had more relationships that integrated sexuality to a greater degree, and so I've begun to better understand how it changes the dynamics of a relationship, and how the relationships, those sort of very close, intimate, quasi-romantic relationships I was forming before are like and unlike relationships that involve sex. And what I've found is that it's an interesting tool in getting to know people. It has a really, really profound impact on how people see their relationships with me. And they are much more willing to spend time with me, and much more willing to get into conversations about where a relationship is going than they are in relationships that don't involve sex. And those are both things that I really want. Those are both things that make a relationship more stable. And so I'm right now trying to understand kind of how I want to use sexuality as, if I want to use it, and how I might want to use it as a tool in just getting to know people, even though it's not something that I'm oriented towards personally. And that's a very complex kind of process for my own identity, but I think an important one, and also one that a number of asexual people are going through, realizing that living in the world that we live in, sexuality makes sense as part of our tool for connecting with people, even if it's not what we're oriented towards.
Yeah, one just thing to add to that is 1% of the population is asexual, and That means that's a lot. I mean, there's a lot of people out there who are not. And specifically in the 1%, there are asexuals who are having sex. They identify as asexual, but in order to be in a romantic relationship, they're having sex. And so it was complicated dealing with that in the film, because I think there's this desire to say, it's just clean if asexuals are not interested in having sex, they're not having any sex, and that's it. But in actuality, a lot of people who are interested in romantic relationships, they're having sex and they're negotiating that in their lives, and that may not necessarily be something that they have an attraction, a desire, something they want to do, but they want partnership, they want intimacy, and we thought it was important to show, David's struggle with that and to include that in the film too.
Right here.
I have a two-part question. I was really drawn to the subject of the asexual community feeling a part of the larger community, and I'm very proud gay man, and I'm always like, if you feel at home in our community, well then you're my brothers and sisters. So that's my stance on it, but it's a twofold question. I wonder if you can speak to that, and how you feel the asexual community is identifying with the LGBT community, or is not. Because I see both sides of that fence.